He cut the ropes on the burlap sack, expecting supplies, maybe grain, maybe salted pork. But what tumbled out onto the frozen Montana dirt wasn't cargo. It was a person, a woman, bruised, bone-thin, and so utterly broken she was almost unrecognizable. He stared, his heart a frozen lump in his chest, because he knew that face. He'd wept over that face, shoveled dirt over that face 3 years ago. It was his wife, Celia, a woman he had mourned, a woman he had buried. A ghost returned from a grave he had dug with his own 2 hands. Who had taken her? What unspeakable hell had she crawled through to get back to him? And the most chilling question of all, if she was here, breathing, who or what was in that coffin? The Montana sky in 1873 was a cold, empty canvas, just like Malcolm Hart's soul. 3 long years, 3 years since the fever had stolen his wife Celia and his boy Jonah. The ranch, once a place of laughter and warm light, was now just a tomb with a roof. Every creak of the floorboards was a whisper from a ghost. Malcolm didn't live anymore. He just survived. He worked until his muscles screamed, mending fences, tending the few cattle he had left, chopping wood until his hands were raw. Anything to make the silence bearable. The silence was the worst part. This morning was no different. Frost clung to the world like a shroud. He rose before the sun, built a fire, and ate his lonely meal. He pulled on his worn wool coat and stepped out into the biting air. He was heading for the north pasture to fix a fence line snapped by the wind. His boots sank into the hard earth, each step a chore. He scanned the horizon, a habit from a lifetime spent in a land that could kill you in 100 different ways. Nothing ever changed out here, until it did. Just past a stand of skeletal aspen trees, something was wrong. A shape that didn't belong. A wagon. It wasn't his. It was tilted, one wheel shattered, its canvas cover ripped and flapping in the wind like a wounded bird. It was just left there, abandoned. Malcolm hadn't felt curiosity in 3 years, but now a flicker of it sparked in his gut. He moved slow, his hand resting on the colt at his hip. A wagon like this, out here, usually meant one thing: trouble. As he got closer, the silence felt different, deeper, unnatural. There were no horses, no tracks leading away from the wreck, just the deep ruts the wagon had carved into the earth before it just stopped. He walked a slow circle around it. The inside was a black maw of shadow, and that's when he saw them. 2 large burlap sacks tucked up against the broken wheel, almost hidden. They were tied shut with thick rope. Their shape was lumpy, uneven. He knelt down, the frozen ground crunching under his boots. He reached out a hand, his fingers hesitating just before they touched the rough canvas. It was cold, and there was a strange softness beneath the surface. What was in them? His mind, so used to the simple, brutal math of grief, couldn't make sense of it. Was it supplies? Or was it something else? Something terrible? A cold dread, colder than the morning frost, began to creep up his spine. Every instinct he had screamed at him to turn around, to walk away, to get on his horse and ride until he forgot he ever saw this. But he couldn't. This strange, broken thing had shattered the gray monotony of his life, and he had to know. He took a ragged breath. A man who had already lost everything has nothing left to fear. His fingers, stiff from the cold and disuse, fumbled with the knot. It was tight, stubborn. Finally, it gave. He pulled back the flap of canvas. What he saw broke his mind. Inside, curled up like a newborn, was a woman. Her hair was a matted, filthy mess, caked with mud and something that looked like dried blood. Her dress was in tatters, barely covering a body that was little more than skin and bones. She was covered in angry bruises, old and new. She was breathing, but they were shallow, stuttering gasps. A ghost, a dying ghost. His heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, gave a violent jolt. It felt like a bullet hitting him. His mind screamed, trying to reject what his eyes were seeing. His hand trembled as he reached out and brushed the filthy hair from her face. Under all the grime and the pain, he saw it. A faint, white scar that traced her left eyebrow, the tiny dimple just above her lip that only appeared when she breathed out, the sharp, proud line of her jaw, the scattering of freckles across her nose. It was Celia. It was his Celia, the woman he put in the ground, the woman he'd said goodbye to. It was impossible. He knew it was impossible. He had stood right there. He had watched them lower the pine box. He had shoveled the first spadeful of dirt himself. But she was here, alive, barely. The shock was so pure, so absolute, it froze him to the spot. A tremor started in his hands and spread through his whole body. He wanted to scream with joy, a sound of pure, impossible relief, but his throat was locked tight. And right behind that wave of impossible hope came the pain. The grief he had packed down so deep inside him, the grief he had tried to bury under years of hard labor and silence. It all came ripping back to the surface, fresh and raw and bleeding. He was on his knees in the dirt, the cold seeping into his bones. But he didn't feel it. All he could do was look at her, trying to burn this impossible truth into his brain. She wasn't the woman he remembered. The light in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, ancient weariness. She was a shadow of herself. But she was breathing. That was all that mattered. He didn't ask how, he didn't ask why. Those questions were for later. Right now, his whole world had shrunk to this one, single purpose: protect her. She was hurt. She was starving. She was on the edge of death. She needed warmth. She needed food. She needed to live. He reached into the sack and carefully, so carefully, lifted her out. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sticks, a fallen leaf. He cradled her against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. He could feel the faint, fluttery beat of her heart against his ribs. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He turned and started walking back to the ranch house. That house, which had been his prison of sorrow for so long, now looked like a lighthouse in a storm. The wind howled around him, trying to rip her from his arms, but he barely felt it. He just kept his eyes on his home, a new fire burning in his gut. He would get her inside. He would clean her wounds. He would sit by her side until she woke up. The past could wait. The questions could wait. All that mattered was Celia. Celia alive in his arms, and he made a silent vow, a promise to God and to whatever devil had let her go, that he would never, ever let her go again. He brought her into the house and laid her on their bed, the bed that had been cold for 3 years. He worked with a strange, frantic tenderness, cleaning the grime from her skin, gently washing the blood from her hair. He found she was covered in marks, not just bruises, but strange symbols, almost like brands, burned into her skin on her back and arms. They were ugly, jagged things, a language of pain he couldn't understand. She didn't wake. She just lay there, her breathing a faint whisper in the silent house. The hours bled together. He sat in a chair by the bed, his shotgun across his lap, watching her, watching the door. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged reality. She was back, but she hadn't come back alone. She had brought the darkness with her. He kept seeing the abandoned wagon, the empty sacks, the brands on her skin. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was organized, cruel. The next morning she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. They were vacant, haunted pools of memory. She looked at him, but he wasn't sure if she saw him. "Malcolm," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It was the first time he'd heard her voice in 3 years, and it broke him all over again. He knelt by the bed, taking her hand. It was cold and fragile. "I'm here, Celia. You're safe." Her eyes searched his face, and then a flicker of something. Recognition. Fear. She tried to sit up, a sudden panicked energy coursing through her. "The boy," she gasped, her voice cracking. "Jonah, where is my boy?" Malcolm's blood ran cold. He had assumed, he had been told, the fever took them both. He had buried 2 coffins, one large, one small. "Celia," he said, his own voice shaking. "Jonah, he's gone. The fever. Remember." She stared at him, her eyes wide with a horror that had nothing to do with memory loss. A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "No," she whispered. The word was a blade. "Not the fever. They took him. They took my son." The floor dropped out from under Malcolm's world for the second time in 2 days. Jonah was alive. He had been taken. For 3 years his son had been out there somewhere, in the hands of the same people who had done this to his wife. And he had done nothing. He had mourned a lie. A cold, hard fury began to build in his chest, an anger so pure and white-hot it burned away the grief. He had mourned. Now it was time to hunt. But before he could even process this new, terrible reality, another thought struck him, a question so monstrous he was afraid to even think it. He looked at Celia, her eyes wild with a truth she couldn't speak. He thought of the 2 coffins. He thought of the town doctor who had signed the death certificates, a man who had packed up and left St. Hollow a week later without a word of explanation. "Celia," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "if you're here and Jonah was taken, then who did I bury?" She didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and a shudder racked her thin frame. She was gone again, retreated back into the darkness inside her head, leaving him alone with a question that would haunt his every waking moment. Who was in those graves? He had to know. That night, under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver moon, Malcolm Hart took a shovel and walked to the small, sad cemetery behind the church. He walked past the weathered wooden crosses of his neighbors, friends, people who had shared his grief, who had patted his shoulder and told him time was a healer. They were all liars. Time hadn't healed a thing. It had just covered a festering wound. He stood before the 2 mounds of earth, his own handiwork. One marked Celia Hart, beloved wife. The other Jonah Hart, beloved son. The words were a mockery. He started with Jonah's. The ground was hard, frozen solid. Each thrust of the shovel was an agony, sending jolts of pain up his arms. It felt like he was digging through his own heart. The sound of the steel scraping against the rocky soil was the only sound in the world. After what felt like an eternity, the shovel hit something. A dull, hollow thud. Wood. He worked faster now, his breath coming in ragged clouds, clearing the dirt away from the small pine box. He pried the lid open with the edge of his shovel. It came loose with a groan of protest. He held his lantern over the opening and looked inside. The coffin was filled with rocks, heavy, useless fieldstones, packed in tight to give it weight. There was nothing else, just rocks. A sob, raw and guttural, escaped his lips. He had mourned a box of stones. He had wept over a lie paid for in weight. He stumbled back, the fury and the grief warring inside him, until he thought he would be torn apart. He turned to Celia's grave. He already knew what he would find, but he had to see it. He had to know the full depth of the lie that had been his life for the past 3 years. He dug again, his movements frantic, reckless. He didn't care about the noise. He didn't care if anyone saw him. Let them see. Let the whole world see the sham his life had become. He uncovered her coffin, splintering the lid in his haste, and he looked inside. It wasn't rocks. There was a body in this one. But it wasn't Celia. It was a woman, a stranger, dressed in Celia's favorite blue calico dress. Her face was gaunt, her body wasted, as if from a long illness. Fever. It was the woman the doctor had shown him, her face partially covered, telling him it was for the best, that the sickness had taken a terrible toll. He had believed it. In his grief, he had believed it. He had buried a stranger in his wife's grave, dressed her in his wife's clothes, and put his wife's name on her marker. The whole town had been fooled. Or had they? A new, colder suspicion began to take root in his heart. How could a deception this elaborate be pulled off by one man? The doctor couldn't have done this alone. Someone else had to have known. Someone in this town. Someone who had watched him grieve, who had offered him condolences, all while knowing the truth. He looked up from the open graves at the sleeping town of St. Hollow, its windows dark and shuttered. It no longer looked like a sanctuary. It looked like a cage full of secrets. He filled the graves back in, his movements methodical, precise. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was an executioner. He walked back to his ranch, the shovel resting on his shoulder like a rifle. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern sky with fingers of pale gray light. When he walked into the bedroom, Celia was awake. She was sitting up in bed, clutching a small carved wooden horse in her hand. It was Jonah's. Malcolm had made it for him for his 5th birthday. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not just fear, but a question. Did he know? He nodded slowly. "Rocks," he said, his voice flat and dead. "And a stranger." A look of profound, heart-wrenching relief washed over her face. She had been carrying this burden alone, terrified of what he would do, what he would think. She finally started to talk. Her voice was weak, hesitant, the story coming out in broken pieces, like shards of shattered glass. It wasn't a fever. It was a raid. A group of men, their faces covered, had descended on the ranch while he was in town for supplies. They were brutal, efficient. They took her and Jonah. They killed the ranch hand who tried to stop them and left the body for the doctor to find. The doctor was part of it. He was their man in the town, providing them with information, covering their tracks. He'd had the other body, the woman who had died of a real fever, ready and waiting. The whole thing was a performance, staged for his benefit. Celia spoke of a long, nightmarish journey, of being sold, of a place deep in the mountains, a camp run by a man they called the Patriarch, a man who collected people like some men collect butterflies. She and Jonah had been separated. She hadn't seen him since that first week, but she knew he was alive. She could feel it. She had finally escaped during a chaotic transfer, hiding in one of the supply sacks on the back of a wagon, praying it would lead her somewhere, anywhere, away from that hell. She had gotten lucky. The wagon had broken down on his land. She had come home. But home was no longer safe. The men who took her, they didn't just sell people. They were meticulous. They didn't like loose ends. And Celia Byrne was the biggest loose end of them all. They would be coming for her. And now they would be coming for him, too. The house, his fortress of grief, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Malcolm knew they couldn't stay, but they couldn't run either. Celia was too weak, and where would they go? These men, this patriarch, they sounded like they had eyes everywhere. The town of St. Hollow was the only place they had, but it was a town built on a lie. Who could they trust? The sheriff? Sheriff Brody was a lazy, complacent man who was more interested in his lunch than the law. Malcolm had never trusted him, and now he suspected him. The doctor had been a respected man in town. How had no one noticed his sudden departure? How had no one questioned the swiftness of the deaths, the closed coffin funeral? The whispers started almost immediately. Celia was a ghost, a woman returned from the dead. At first it was just hushed speculation in the general store, veiled glances on the street. But fear is a poison, and it spreads fast. The story of her return was too strange, too unsettling. It didn't fit into the simple, orderly world they had built for themselves. so they made up their own stories. She was touched in the head. She was a bad omen. Some even whispered she'd made a deal with the devil to escape the grave. The women clutched their children's hands a little tighter when she passed. The men looked at her with a mixture of pity and a dark, predatory curiosity. They didn't see a survivor. They saw a stain. They saw a woman who had been somewhere she shouldn't have been, who had seen things she shouldn't have seen. Her very existence was a reminder of the savagery that lay just beyond their picket fences, and they hated her for it. Malcolm saw the looks. He heard the whispers, and his rage simmered. These were the same people who had mourned with him. Now they judged her. He started carrying his rifle everywhere he went. He boarded up some of the windows. He and Celia lived in a state of siege, prisoners in their own home. She barely ate, haunted by nightmares that made her scream in her sleep. During the day she was a phantom, drifting from room to room, her hands constantly moving, cleaning, scrubbing, as if trying to wash away the memory of what had been done to her. She would spend hours in Jonah's room, just sitting on his bed, holding his wooden horse, her face a mask of impenetrable grief. She wouldn't talk about the camp. She wouldn't talk about the patriarch. Whenever Malcolm tried to ask, a wall came down, and she would retreat back into her silence. He knew she was protecting him, or maybe herself, from a truth too terrible to speak aloud. One afternoon he found her staring at the side of the old barn, at a spot where Jonah had measured his height each year. The pencil marks were still there, faint but visible. She was tracing the highest one with her finger. "He'd be 10 now," she whispered. He was so proud of being tall. It was the first time she had spoken of him as if he were still a growing boy, not a ghost. It was a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the vast darkness. Malcolm knew then that he couldn't just wait for them to come. He had to do something. He had to find his son. He rode into St. Hollow, his jaw set. He was going to see the sheriff. He didn't expect help, but he wanted to see the man's face when he told him the story. He wanted to look him in the eye and see if he could find a flicker of a lie. Sheriff Brody was, as usual, tilted back in his chair, his boots on his desk. He listened to Malcolm's story with a bored expression, occasionally picking at his teeth with a splinter of wood. When Malcolm finished, the sheriff just sighed. "Now, Malcolm," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you've been through a lot. A man sees things after what you've been through. Your wife, well, the ordeal has clearly rattled her." "I dug up the graves, Brody," Malcolm said, his voice low and dangerous. "I saw them with my own eyes." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, just for a second. "That's desecration of a grave, Hart. That's a serious crime." "So is kidnapping. So is murder." "You have no proof," Brody said, swinging his boots off the desk. "Just the word of a traumatized woman. A wagon breaks down. You find your wife, who you thought was dead. It's a miracle, Malcolm. Accept it. Go home. Take care of your wife. Leave the law to me." Malcolm stood there, his hands clenched into fists. Brody wasn't just lazy. He was hiding something. He knew, or at the very least he was terrified of getting involved. As Malcolm turned to leave the office, his eyes fell on a rack of wanted posters, and one of them made his blood freeze. It was an old, weathered poster for a man named Dale Mercer, wanted for cattle rustling. The face was cruel, with a sneering mouth and cold, dead eyes. But it wasn't the face that caught his attention. It was the brand shown on the poster, the one Mercer used on his cattle. It was the same jagged, ugly symbol that was burned into Celia's skin. Malcolm ripped the poster off the wall and stormed out of the office, Brody's shouts echoing behind him. He rode home like a man possessed. He burst into the house and showed the poster to Celia. The moment she saw the face, all the color drained from hers. She recoiled, a small, wounded animal sound escaping her lips. Him, she whispered. He was one of them. He was the one who took Jonah from me. She collapsed into sobs, her body shaking uncontrollably. Malcolm held her, his mind racing. He finally had a name. Dale Mercer. It was a thread, a place to start pulling. He didn't know it yet, but he had just pulled a thread that would unravel not just his own life, but the entire town of St. Hollow. The game had changed. He wasn't waiting for them to come to him anymore. He was going hunting. The wanted poster was a key. A rusty, blood-stained key, but a key nonetheless. Dale Mercer. The name was a curse on Malcolm's tongue. He spent his days watching over Celia, his nights studying the poster, trying to burn the man's cruel face into his memory. Celia remained fragile, a bird with a broken wing. The sight of the poster had thrown her back into the depths of her trauma, but it had also broken something loose. Small details started to surface, fragments of memory she would offer up in a whisper. She remembered Mercer's laugh, a harsh, grating sound. She remembered the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. She remembered the names of other men he spoke with. Silas, Jeb, and the one they all seemed to fear, the one they only referred to as the Patriarch. The names were ghosts, but now they were ghosts with names. Malcolm knew he couldn't take on a whole gang by himself. He needed help. But who in St. Hollow could he trust? The sheriff was either a coward or a conspirator. The townspeople were lost in their own fear and prejudice. There was only one person he could think of. Noah Callan. Noah was a blacksmith, a quiet, powerful man who had lost his own family to a raid by natives years ago. He was a man who understood loss, and he was one of the few who hadn't treated Celia like a leper. He had simply nodded at Malcolm in the street, his eyes filled with a sad, knowing understanding. Malcolm found him at his forge, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. He told Noah everything: the empty graves, the stranger in Celia's dress, the brands, the wanted poster. Noah listened without interruption, his hammer resting by his side, his face grim. When Malcolm finished, Noah was silent for a long moment. Then he looked Malcolm square in the eye. "My wife and daughter weren't killed by natives," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That was the story the sheriff put out. It was easier for the town to swallow. They were taken from our home, just like your Celia, just like your boy." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Malcolm wasn't alone. Noah had been living with the same secret, the same gnawing helplessness, for years. "It's them, isn't it?" Malcolm asked. "Mercer's gang." Noah nodded slowly. "They go by many names, but it's them. They run this whole territory. They have men in every town, eyes in every saloon. The sheriff, he's too scared to move against them. We all are." A bond was forged between them in that moment, stronger than any steel Noah could hammer. They were two fathers, two husbands, united by a shared nightmare. They agreed to work together, to gather information, to wait for the right moment to strike. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had something the Mercer gang didn't: a reason to die. Weeks turned into a month. A fragile routine settled over the Hart Ranch. Malcolm and Noah would meet in secret, sharing scraps of information. Celia began to heal in her own slow, painful way. The color returned to her cheeks. She started working in her garden again, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the barren ground. It was a small act of defiance, a refusal to let the darkness win. She even started to play the piano again. At first it was just single, hesitant notes, like a child learning to speak. But soon broken melodies began to fill the quiet house. They were sad songs, full of loss, but they were songs nonetheless. It was the sound of her soul beginning to mend. The town, seeing this slow transformation, began to soften. The whispers didn't disappear, but they grew quieter. A few of the women, led by Mildred Cobb, the town's biggest gossip, started leaving small things on their porch: a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a bundle of fresh herbs. They were peace offerings, apologies without words. They were beginning to see her not as a ghost, but as a survivor. A woman who had been to hell and was fighting her way back, one painful step at a time. The fragile peace was shattered on a blistering hot afternoon in August. Malcolm and Celia were in the general store, stocking up on supplies. Noah was there too, picking up some hardware. The town was quiet, sleepy in the oppressive heat. Then a rider appeared at the end of the street. A lone rider moving with a lazy, arrogant slouch that sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. He recognized him instantly from the poster. Dale Mercer. He dismounted, his spurs jingling a sinister rhythm on the dusty boardwalk. The few people on the street froze, melting back into doorways and alleys. They knew who he was. They knew what he represented. Mercer's eyes scanned the street and then locked on the general store, on Celia. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He walked towards them, his shadow falling long and dark before him. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice a greasy slick of menace. "Look what the cat dragged in. Heard you flew the coop, little bird." He stepped inside the store, the air suddenly thick and hard to breathe. Celia went rigid, her face a mask of pure terror. "There's nothing for you here, Mercer," Malcolm said, stepping in front of her. His hand was hovering over his Colt. Mercer just chuckled, his eyes never leaving Celia. "Oh, but there is, old man. She ran out on a debt, a big one. I'm here to collect." Noah moved to stand beside Malcolm, his own hand on his gun. "Your business is done here," Noah said, his voice tight with years of repressed hatred. Mercer sneered, looking from Noah to Malcolm and back again. "A welcoming committee. You boys don't know who you're messing with. But she does, don't you, little bird? She knows what happens when the patriarch gets upset." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Cold dread turned to white-hot rage in Celia's heart. The memories of the cabin, the powerlessness, the fear. It all came rushing back, but this time it wasn't fear that won. It was fury, a fierce primal instinct to protect the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. She would not go back. She would die first. "She's not going anywhere with you," Malcolm said, his voice dangerously calm. "Oh, she is," Mercer retorted, his hand dropping to his revolver. "One way or another. Step aside, old men, or you can die with her." The street outside was dead silent. The whole town was watching, holding its breath. Dale Mercer, arrogant and overconfident, made his mistake. He thought he was dealing with two scared old men and a broken woman. He drew his gun. But Malcolm and Noah were faster. Gunfire erupted in the small, confined space of the general store. The air exploded with noise and smoke and the splintering of wood. Mercer staggered back, a curse on his lips, returning fire wildly. Celia screamed and ducked behind a stack of flour sacks, the acrid smell of gunpowder burning her nose. Malcolm and Noah used the counter for cover, exchanging shots with Mercer. A bullet grazed Noah's arm and he stumbled. Mercer saw his opening and turned his gun on Malcolm. But before he could fire, another shot rang out. Not from Malcolm's gun, not from Noah's. Malcolm grunted and clutched his side, a dark stain spreading across his shirt, but he was still on his feet. He looked up and saw Celia. She was no longer hiding. Her terror had been burned away, leaving something cold and hard and absolute in its place. She saw Malcolm hit. She saw Mercer, his eyes wild, reloading his pistol. She saw him coming for her again. And in that instant, the victim died. She scrambled from behind the sacks, her eyes locking on the rifle Malcolm had left, leaning against the wall. Her fingers closed around the cold steel. The weight was familiar, comforting. Dale Mercer, seeing her, grinned his cruel grin. "Time to go home, little bird," he hissed, raising his pistol. But Celia was faster. All the years of fear, all the nights of screaming nightmares, all the pain and the loss, it all coalesced into one single, clarifying moment. Her aim was steady. Her breath was even. She raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel at the black heart of the man who had stolen her son, and she pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the sudden silence. Dale Mercer froze. His eyes went wide with a look of pure, stupid surprise. A dark flower bloomed on his chest. He stumbled backward, his revolver clattering to the floor. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He crashed to the ground with a heavy thud and lay still. A profound silence descended, broken only by the lazy buzzing of a fly and the slow drip of molasses from a bullet-riddled barrel. The gunpowder smoke hung in the air, thick and hazy. Celia stood there, the rifle clutched in her hands, her eyes fixed on Mercer's lifeless body. There was no triumph on her face, no regret, only a grim, chilling resolve. The woman who had been found in a sack was gone forever. In her place stood a survivor, a warrior forged in the fires of hell. Malcolm, clutching his bleeding side, looked at her with a kind of awe. Noah, his arm dripping blood, just stared, sobered by the raw, lethal power he had just witnessed. Slowly, the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. They peered into the store. They saw the body on the floor. They saw the rifle in Celia's hands. They saw the unyielding, unbreakable look in her eyes. And no one said a word. The whispers were finally, truly dead. In their place was a new kind of silence, a silence of respect, a silence of fear. They finally understood. Celia Hart wasn't a ghost. She was a reckoning. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, stark shadows across the street. It was the end of a battle. But everyone in that store, everyone in the town of St. Hollow, knew with a chilling certainty that the war was just beginning. And Dale Mercer had a lot of brothers. The death of Dale Mercer was like throwing a rock into a hornet's nest. For a few days, an eerie quiet settled over St. Hollow. It was the silence of anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the other boot to drop. Malcolm's wound was a clean shot, painful but not life-threatening. Celia tended to him with a newfound confidence, her hands steady, her movements efficient. The dynamic between them had shifted. He still saw her as the woman he loved, the woman he would die to protect. But now he also saw her as an equal, a partner in the war that was to come. Noah became a permanent fixture at the ranch, his rifle never far from his side. The three of them formed a small, grim council of war. They knew the Mercers would retaliate. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And how. The town, for its part, was transformed. The fear that had once isolated Celia now rallied the people around her. They saw what she had done not as murder, but as an act of communal defense. Dale Mercer had been a plague on their town for years, and she had been the cure. The men started carrying rifles openly in the street. They organized night watches. The women brought food and supplies to the Hart Ranch, their faces etched with worry, but also with a new, steely resolve. St. Hollow was no longer a town of whispers. It was a town bracing for a siege. About a week after the shootout, a stranger rode into town. He wasn't a gunslinger. He was an old man, a prospector by the looks of him, with a long white beard and clothes that were little more than rags. He asked for Celia Hart by name. Malcolm and Noah met him at the edge of the property, their guns ready. The old man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I ain't here for trouble," he rasped, his voice dry as dust. "I have a message for the lady." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small folded piece of leather. "From the boy," he said. Celia, who had been watching from the porch, came running. She snatched the leather from the old man's hand. Scratched into the surface in a clumsy, childish hand was a single word: courage, and below it a crudely drawn picture of a horse, a wooden horse. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Jonah. "Who are you?" Malcolm demanded, his rifle still trained on the old man. "Just a friend," the prospector said. "I owed the boy a kindness. He helped me when I was sick. He's a good lad, smart, but he's in a bad place." The old man's eyes were full of a deep sadness. "The patriarch. He's taken a special interest in the boy. He's not just a prisoner. He's something else. The patriarch is teaching him things, turning him into one of them." The words hit Celia harder than any bullet. The thought of her son being twisted, corrupted, his bright spirit snuffed out and replaced with the same cold darkness she saw in Dale Mercer's eyes. It was a fate worse than death. "Where is he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The old man shook his head. "The main camp moves around. Hard to find if you don't know where to look, but they're planning something big. A raid on a railroad payroll. They're gathering at a place called Devil's Canyon in 3 days' time. The whole clan will be there. The patriarch, too." He gave them a rough description of the canyon's location. "It's a fortress. You go in there, you ain't coming out. But it's the only chance you'll get. The boy, he told me to tell you. The North Ridge, at dawn." The old man tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away, disappearing into the dust. He left them with an impossible choice. To go to Devil's Canyon was suicide. The Mercer gang would outnumber them 20-1. But to do nothing was to abandon Jonah to a fate she couldn't bear to imagine. There was no choice at all, really. That night they held a meeting in the town hall. Malcolm, Celia, and Noah laid out the situation to the men of St. Hollow. They told them about Devil's Canyon. They told them about the raid. They didn't ask for help. They just told them what they were going to do. "Celia and I are going after our son," Malcolm said, his voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable conviction. "Noah's coming with us. This is our fight. We don't expect any of you to join us." A silence fell over the room. The men looked at each other, at their hands, at the floor. The fear was thick in the air. Then a man stood up. It was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the dry goods store, a meek, bespectacled man who had never fired a gun in anger in his life. "The Mercers took my brother's farm last year," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "They left him with nothing. This ain't just your fight, Malcolm. It's all of ours." Another man stood up, and another, and another. By the end of it, every able-bodied man in St. Hollow was on his feet. They were farmers, shopkeepers, a blacksmith, a preacher. They weren't fighters, but they were done being afraid. For the next 2 days, the town transformed into a military camp. Noah, with his experience, took charge, drilling the men, teaching them how to shoot, how to take cover, how to fight as a unit. Celia, surprisingly, became their strategist. Her time in the camp, as horrific as it was, had given her an insight into how the gang operated. She knew their tactics, their weaknesses. She drew a map of the canyon in the dirt based on the prospector's description and her own fragmented memories of the landscape. She planned the assault, her voice clear and steady. She was no longer a victim seeking rescue. She was a general planning a war. On the 3rd day, just before dawn, a small army of 20 men rode out of St. Hollow. They were a strange-looking militia, armed with old hunting rifles and farm tools, but their faces were set with a grim determination. They were riding towards a place called Devil's Canyon. They were riding towards a battle they had no right to win. They were riding to get a little boy's wooden horse back. As they rode, Malcolm looked over at Celia. She was riding tall in the saddle, the rifle resting easily in her arms. The rising sun caught the fire in her hair. The fear was still in her eyes, he could see it. But underneath it was something else, something fierce and beautiful and terrifying. It was the look of a mother going to get her child, and Malcolm knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that hell was coming for the Mercer clan, and his wife was leading the charge. The approach to Devil's Canyon was a descent into hell. The landscape grew twisted and barren, the rocks stained a deep blood red. They left the horses a mile back and moved on foot, silent as ghosts, the men from St. Hollow clutching their rifles, their knuckles white. Celia led them, her movements sure and certain, as if she were navigating a landscape from her own nightmares. She brought them to a ridge overlooking the canyon, the spot the old prospector had mentioned. Below them, nestled in the canyon floor, was the Mercer camp. It was a sprawling, chaotic collection of tents and lean-tos, buzzing with activity. There were at least 50 men down there, heavily armed, preparing for their raid. It was a hornet's nest, just as the prospector had said. At the center of the camp was a larger tent, and standing before it was a tall, imposing figure with a long gray beard. He was surrounded by a handful of men who seemed to be his lieutenants. The patriarch. Even from this distance, Malcolm could feel the man's aura of absolute authority. And then they saw him, a small boy with dark hair, standing near the patriarch. He wasn't in chains. He wasn't being guarded. He was just there. He was dressed like the other men, in buckskins, and he had a small knife tucked into his belt. He was watching the patriarch with an unnerving intensity. It was Jonah. But it was a different Jonah. There was a hardness in his eyes, a stillness in his posture that didn't belong on a 10-year-old boy. The sight of him sent a fresh wave of agony through Celia. What had they done to him? The North Ridge. At dawn, Jonah had told the prospector. He knew they were coming. He had given them a way in. Celia pointed to a narrow, treacherous-looking path that led from their position down into the canyon. "That's our way," she said. "They won't be expecting an attack from above. We create a diversion at the main entrance. The rest of us go down that path. We get the boy, and we get out." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. They divided their small force. Noah took 10 men to create the diversion. Malcolm, Celia, and the remaining 8 would go down the path. They would only have a few minutes before the entire camp descended on them. As Noah and his men slipped away, Malcolm turned to Celia. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. She looked at Jonah down in the canyon, her face a mask of love and fury. "I was born for this," she said. The first shots from Noah's group echoed through the canyon, and the camp erupted into chaos. Men scrambled for their guns, shouting and running towards the main entrance. It was the diversion they needed. "Now!" Celia commanded. They scrambled down the narrow path, rocks skittering under their boots. They moved fast, their only goal the center of the camp, where Jonah was. Down below, the patriarch didn't panic. He barked orders, sending most of his men to repel Noah's attack, keeping his personal guard with him. He grabbed Jonah by the arm, his eyes scanning the canyon walls, already sensing the trap. Malcolm and Celia's group hit the canyon floor running. They were spotted immediately. A firefight erupted, bullets whining off the red rocks. The men from St. Hollow, farmers and shopkeepers, fought like cornered wolves, providing cover fire for Malcolm and Celia. Malcolm moved with a cold, deadly efficiency, his shots finding their mark. But his eyes were on Celia. She was a whirlwind of destruction, moving with a grace and speed that was terrifying. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was a force of nature, an avenging angel cutting a path through the men who had stolen her family. They were almost there. They could see Jonah struggling in the patriarch's grip. The patriarch saw them coming. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and put a knife to Jonah's throat. "That's far enough," he boomed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "One more step, and the boy dies." Everything stopped. The gunfire died down. Malcolm and Celia stood there 20 yards away, their guns trained on the old man. "Let him go," Celia said, her voice shaking with rage. "He's my blood now," the patriarch said with a sickening chuckle. "He's one of us. Aren't you, son?" Jonah didn't answer. He just stared at his mother, his face unreadable. "I'm raising him to be a king," the patriarch continued, "to be better than his weakling father, to take what he wants from the world." "You're a monster," Malcolm spat. "I'm a survivor," the patriarch corrected him, "just like your wife. I saw the fire in her. I knew she was special. That's why I took her. I was going to make her my queen." He tightened his grip on Jonah, the knife pressing against his skin. "But now she's just a loose end. Drop your guns, both of you, or the boy pays the price." Malcolm and Celia looked at each other. They were trapped. They had come so far only to fail at the last moment. Then something shifted in Jonah's eyes. He looked directly at Celia and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Courage. It was a signal. In that split second, Celia understood. She had spent 3 years believing her son was a helpless victim. But he wasn't. Like her, he had been forged in the fire. He was a survivor. She lowered her rifle, a look of defeat on her face. Malcolm, catching her signal, did the same. The patriarch smiled, his victory complete. "Good choice," he said, loosening his grip on Jonah just slightly. It was the opening Jonah had been waiting for. He drove his elbow back, hard, into the patriarch's stomach. The old man grunted, his breath exploding from his lungs. In the same motion, Jonah drew the small knife from his belt and plunged it into the patriarch's leg. The old man screamed in pain and surprise, his hold on Jonah breaking. "Now!" Jonah yelled. It was all the time they needed. Celia and Malcolm raised their rifles and fired in the same instant. The bullets hit the patriarch square in the chest. He staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the dirt. For a moment there was a stunned silence. Then the rest of the Mercer gang, seeing their leader fall, seemed to break. Some threw down their guns and ran. Others, enraged, charged forward. But their fight was gone. Noah's group, their diversion a success, came charging in from the other side. The remaining outlaws were caught in a pincer. The battle was short and brutal. When the dust settled, the Mercer gang was broken, its leaders dead, its power shattered. Malcolm and Celia ran to Jonah, who stood panting, the bloody knife still clutched in his hand. Celia threw her arms around him, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. "My boy," she sobbed, "my brave, brave boy." Jonah hugged her back, burying his face in her shoulder, and for the first time in 3 long years, he cried. He cried like the little boy he was, all the hardness melting away, leaving only the child who had been lost and was now found. Malcolm put his arms around both of them, his own tears falling freely. His family was back. They were broken, they were scarred, but they were whole. They walked out of Devil's Canyon and didn't look back, leaving the ghosts and the nightmares behind them, buried in the blood-red dust. The return to St. Hollow was nothing like Celia's first, lonely homecoming. This time, the whole town was waiting. As the small, weary army rode down the main street, the people poured out of their homes and businesses. They cheered. They wept. They embraced the men who had ridden out to fight for them. When they saw Jonah riding in front of Malcolm, safe and sound, a great roar went up. They were no longer a town of whispers and fear. They were a community, forged in fire and bound by a shared act of courage. The Hart family was finally home. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet healing. Jonah was quiet, watchful, the shadows of his ordeal still clinging to him. But day by day, the boy he was meant to be began to re-emerge. He started to laugh again. He helped Malcolm with the ranch chores. He sat beside Celia at the piano while she played, his head resting on her shoulder. The wooden horse took its rightful place back on his nightstand. The scars, both visible and invisible, remained. They always would. They were a map of where they had been, but they no longer defined them. They had faced the absolute worst of humanity and had not only survived, but had won. They had found their way back not just to each other, but to themselves. Their love, tested by an impossible loss and reforged in a desperate war, was stronger and deeper than it had ever been. It was a quiet, unbreakable thing, a testament to the power of holding on. Their homestead was no longer a tomb or a fortress. It was a beacon, a symbol for the entire town of St. Hollow that even in the harshest, most unforgiving land, hope could bloom. Malcolm and Celia, the man who had buried a lie and the woman who had returned from the dead, were no longer defined by their tragedy. They were defined by their choice to fight, to endure, and to rebuild their lives together, a small, stubborn light against the vast, encroaching darkness. As we close the book on this chapter from the untamed frontier, we're left with more than just a story. We're left with a powerful truth about the human spirit. The Old West wasn't just a place of gunslingers and gold rushes. It was a crucible that tested the very soul of the people who dared to call it home. It forced them to confront their deepest fears and decide what they were willing to fight for, to die for. Celia and Malcolm's story reminds us that the deepest wounds can heal, that the darkest night eventually gives way to the dawn, and that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. What do you think is the most powerful force for survival? Hope, love, or the thirst for justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of resilience and redemption moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true tales from the heart of the American West.